Have you ever been in a relationship where you found yourself walking on eggshells, constantly afraid of saying the wrong thing? Maybe you live somewhere like Texas or Florida where people still believe in standing up for others. Or maybe you're in a place where everyone minds their own business. Either way, what would you do if you witnessed someone being threatened in public and you had the power to stop it? Celeste Rivera had been walking on those eggshells for 8 months now, and tonight they were finally cracking beneath her feet. At 24, she should have been confident, successful, proud of the graphic design business she was slowly building from her tiny studio apartment. Instead, she sat across from Derek Mathis in Romano's, one of Chicago's most expensive Italian restaurants, watching his jaw tighten with that familiar, dangerous tension that made her stomach clench with dread. The restaurant was beautiful, all warm lighting and soft jazz, the kind of place she'd dreamed of being taken to when she was younger and still believed in romance. White tablecloths, fresh flowers, waiters who moved like dancers between the closely spaced tables. The kind of place where normal couples celebrated anniversaries and proposals, where conversation flowed as smoothly as the wine. But nothing about her relationship with Derek had ever been normal, and tonight was proving to be a spectacular example of just how wrong everything between them had gone. Derek's fork scraped against his plate with unnecessary force, the sound making her flinch. He'd been in a mood since picking her up, criticizing her dress, her makeup, the way she'd done her hair. The black cocktail dress she'd chosen with such care now felt too tight, too revealing, wrong somehow. Everything felt wrong when Derek looked at her like that, like she was a problem he needed to solve rather than the woman he claimed to love. She tried to make conversation about the food, about work, about anything that might soften the hard line of his mouth, but every attempt fell flat. When she mentioned landing a new client, a small bakery that wanted help with their branding, Derek's expression darkened further. "That's not a real client, Celeste," he said, cutting into his steak with violent precision. "You're playing at being a businesswoman with these little hobby projects. When are you going to get serious and apply for actual jobs?" The words hit her like physical blows, each one carefully calculated to wound. She'd been so excited about the bakery, so proud that they'd found her through word of mouth, that they trusted her with something so important to them. But Derek had a way of taking her victories and twisting them until they felt like failures. "I am serious," she said quietly, hating how small her voice sounded. "I'm building something. It takes time." "Building something," Derek repeated, his voice rising just enough that the couple at the next table glanced over. "You're delusional, Celeste. Playing with your little computer programs while I work 60 hours a week to keep us afloat. Do you have any idea what I sacrifice for you?" The familiar guilt crashed over her like a wave. Derek worked in finance, made good money, and yes, he helped with her rent sometimes when clients were slow to pay. But the way he threw it in her face, the way he made her feel like a burden, like someone who owed him everything and deserved nothing. Her therapist, back when she'd still been allowed to see her therapist, had tried to help her recognize these patterns. But it was so hard to think clearly when Derek was looking at her like that, when his disappointment felt like drowning. "I know you work hard," she whispered. "I appreciate everything you do." "Do you?" "Because it doesn't feel like it. It feels like you're taking advantage of my generosity while you chase this ridiculous dream that's never going to amount to anything." The restaurant seemed to fade around them, the warm lighting and gentle conversation becoming background noise to the nightmare happening at their table. Celeste felt the familiar sensation of shrinking, of becoming smaller and smaller until she might disappear entirely. This was how it always went. Derek would build up to these moments, these explosions of anger and disappointment, and she would absorb it all, apologize for existing, for wanting things, for being herself. But tonight felt different. Maybe it was the public setting, the way other diners were starting to notice their table, the way Derek's voice carried in the intimate space. Maybe it was the wine, or the fact that she'd had such a good day before this dinner, before Derek reminded her that her happiness was conditional, temporary, subject to his approval. "You know what?" Derek said, his voice dropping to that dangerous whisper that somehow felt more threatening than shouting. "I'm done with this conversation. We're leaving. Now." She started to stand, conditioned to obey, to minimize the scene, to get them out of public before his anger really exploded. But then Derek's hand shot across the table, his fingers wrapping around her wrist with bruising force. "And when we get home," he said, loud enough now that several nearby tables could hear clearly, "you're done with this business fantasy. You're going to delete that website, cancel whatever ridiculous contracts you think you have, and start acting like the adult I've been trying to turn you into. You're done when we get home, Celeste. Done playing games." The words hung in the air like poison, and Celeste felt something inside her crack that had nothing to do with eggshells. The humiliation of being spoken to like a child, like property, in front of strangers, in this beautiful restaurant that was supposed to be special. The way Derek's grip on her wrist made her feel trapped, owned, like she had no choices left at all. She looked around desperately, part of her hoping someone would intervene, would see what was happening and help her. But most people were determinedly looking away, uncomfortable with the domestic drama playing out so close to their romantic dinners. She couldn't blame them. She'd probably do the same thing if she saw this happening to someone else. People didn't want to get involved in other people's problems, especially when those problems involved a man as angry and unpredictable as Derek. But then her eyes met another pair across the restaurant, and everything changed. The man was sitting at a table near the windows, close enough to have heard Derek's threat, far enough away that she hadn't noticed him before. But she noticed him now. Oh, did she notice him now? He was older than Derek, probably in his early 30s, with olive skin and dark hair styled in that effortlessly perfect way that suggested expensive barbers and careful attention to detail. But it was his eyes that held her, dark and intense, focused on their table with a concentration that made her breath catch. He was wearing a suit that probably cost more than her rent, charcoal gray that fit him like it had been made specifically for his broad shoulders and lean frame. There was something about the way he held himself, the way the two men at his table deferred to him, that suggested power. Real power, the kind that didn't need to shout or grab women's wrists to make itself known. And he was looking at Derek like he was considering whether it would be worth the trouble to kill him right here in Romanos. The intensity of that gaze, the way it seemed to see everything, understand everything, made Celeste feel suddenly exposed. This stranger had witnessed her humiliation, had seen Derek grab her, heard the threat. But instead of looking away like everyone else, he was looking at Derek like he represented a problem that needed solving. Derek, oblivious to the scrutiny, tightened his grip on her wrist and started to pull her toward the exit. But before they could take more than a step, the dark-haired man was standing, moving with a fluid grace that suggested he was very comfortable with his body, very sure of his place in the world. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying easily across the space between their tables. His accent held just a hint of something, maybe Italian, wrapped around words that sounded polite but carried an undertone of steel. "I couldn't help but notice the lady seems distressed." Derek turned, his grip on Celeste's wrist loosening slightly as he assessed this new threat. She could see him taking in the stranger's expensive clothes, his confident posture, trying to decide if this was someone he needed to worry about. "This is none of your business," Derek said, his voice carrying all the bravado he could muster. "This is between me and my girlfriend." The stranger smiled, but it wasn't a friendly expression. It was the kind of smile that suggested Derek had just made a very poor choice in words. "When a man threatens a woman in public, it becomes everyone's business," he said, taking a step closer. "Especially when that woman looks like she might need assistance." Celeste felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she watched these two men face each other, Derek's familiar anger meeting something much more dangerous in this elegant stranger. She should say something, should diffuse the situation before it escalated. But she couldn't find her voice, couldn't move, could only watch as someone finally stood up for her in a way no one ever had before. And despite the danger crackling in the air between them, despite not knowing anything about the man who was defending her, Celeste Rivera felt something she hadn't experienced in months. She felt safe. The confrontation in Romanos had ended swiftly once the stranger stepped forward. Derek, faced with someone who clearly wasn't intimidated by his anger, had deflated like a punctured balloon. There had been words exchanged, quiet and intense, that Celeste couldn't quite hear over the rushing sound in her ears. But the result was Derek storming out alone, shooting venomous looks back at their table, while she remained behind with this elegant stranger who had somehow managed to make her feel safe in the span of 5 minutes. Now she sat in the passenger seat of a car that probably cost more than she made in 2 years, watching Chicago's lights blur past the windows as they moved through the city toward a destination she didn't know. The man had introduced himself simply as Domenico, though his driver had called him Mr. Torino when he'd appeared at the restaurant's entrance, as if summoned by some invisible signal. The car itself was a revelation, all soft leather and subtle technology, moving so smoothly through traffic that she barely felt the motion. It was the kind of vehicle she'd only seen in movies, and sitting in it made her feel like she'd stepped into someone else's life entirely. Her own beat-up Honda, with its temperamental air conditioning and check engine light that had been on for 6 months, seemed like something from a different universe. Domenico sat beside her, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and understated that made her think of warmth and safety. He'd given her his jacket when they'd left the restaurant, noticing her slight shiver in the evening air before she'd even realized she was cold. It was too big for her, but the silk lining was warm against her skin, and she found herself pulling it closer, wrapping herself in the scent of him. "You don't have to be afraid," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the soft hum of the engine. "Derek won't bother you tonight, or any other night, if I have anything to say about it." She wanted to ask how he could be so certain, what kind of power he had that made him speak with such quiet authority. But part of her was afraid to know the answer. The way Derek had backed down, the expensive car, the driver who appeared instantly when needed, all of it suggested that Domenico Torino was not someone who made idle promises or issued empty threats. "I don't understand why you're helping me," she said finally, the words coming out smaller than she'd intended. "You don't even know me." "I know enough," he replied, turning to look at her with those dark eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. "I know that no woman should be spoken to the way he spoke to you. I know that you're afraid of him, and that you shouldn't have to be." The simple statement hit her harder than Derek's cruelest words ever had, because it was said with such matter-of-fact certainty, as if her right to safety and respect were as fundamental as breathing. When had she stopped believing that? When had she started accepting Derek's treatment as normal, as something she deserved? They pulled up to a building that stretched toward the sky like a glass and steel monument to wealth and power. The doorman greeted Domenico by name, tipping his hat respectfully, and suddenly Celeste understood exactly how far out of her league this entire situation had become. This wasn't just expensive. This was old money, generational wealth, the kind of life she'd only read about in magazines. The elevator ride to the top floor was conducted in silence, but she was hyper-aware of everything. The soft classical music playing overhead, the polished brass of the buttons, the way Domenico stood perfectly at ease while she felt like an imposter in her cocktail dress and borrowed jacket. By the time the doors opened directly into his penthouse, she was fighting the urge to run. The space that greeted them was breathtaking and intimidating in equal measure. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Chicago's skyline, the city spread out below them like scattered diamonds. The furniture was clearly expensive but comfortable, all clean lines and rich fabrics in muted colors that spoke of sophisticated taste. Art that she suspected was original hung on the walls, and everything about the space suggested a life lived without financial constraints. Her own studio apartment, with its second-hand furniture and creative storage solutions, could probably fit in his living room with space left over. The contrast wasn't just stark, it was overwhelming, a reminder of exactly how different their worlds were. "Please, sit," Domenico said, gesturing toward a sectional sofa that probably cost more than her car. "Can I get you something to drink? Wine? Water?" "Water would be good," she managed, settling carefully onto the edge of the couch as if she might somehow damage it by sitting too heavily. Everything felt fragile and precious, including herself in this space that belonged to someone who clearly had everything money could buy. He disappeared into what she assumed was the kitchen, and she took the opportunity to really look around, to try to understand who this man was who had rescued her from Derek's fury. The space was immaculate but lived in, books on the coffee table, a wine glass left on the side table from earlier in the evening. Personal but not revealing, expensive but not ostentatious. It was the home of someone who had power but didn't need to display it constantly. When he returned with her water, he'd removed his suit jacket and rolled up his sleeves, making him look slightly less formal, slightly more approachable. But there was still something about him, the way he moved with absolute confidence in his own space, that reminded her she was dealing with someone far more complex than the average businessman. "Now," he said, settling onto the other end of the couch, far enough away that she didn't feel crowded but close enough that she could see the concern in his dark eyes. "Tell me about Derek." The request was simple, but it opened floodgates she'd been holding back for months. Maybe it was the wine from dinner, or the adrenaline crash from the confrontation, or simply the relief of being away from Derek's constant criticism and control. But suddenly she was talking, telling this virtual stranger about the slow erosion of her self-worth, the way Derek had gradually isolated her from friends and family, the escalating patterns of emotional abuse that had become her daily reality. Domenico listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker with each revelation. When she showed him the bruises on her wrist from Derek's grip at the restaurant, she saw something dangerous flash in his eyes, something that made her suddenly very glad she wasn't Derek Mathis. He started out so different, she found herself explaining, wrapping his jacket more tightly around herself. "Charming, attentive, like he thought I was amazing. But then little things started changing. He'd get upset if I spent time with friends, said they were bad influences. He convinced me to stop seeing my therapist, said I was using therapy as an excuse to avoid dealing with real problems. He made me feel like I was lucky he put up with me, like no one else would ever want someone as flawed as I was." The words came out in a rush, months of suppressed truth finally finding voice. She told him about Derek monitoring her bank account, criticizing her business efforts, making her feel guilty for having dreams and ambitions beyond their relationship. She told him about the gradual erosion of her confidence, the way she'd started second-guessing every decision, every word, every thought. "My family doesn't even know how bad it's gotten," she admitted, staring down at her hands. "I haven't talked to my sister in weeks because Derek said she was poisoning me against him. I missed my cousin's wedding because Derek had a crisis at work that required my support. I've been making excuses for him so long that I almost started believing them myself." When she finally looked up, she found Domenico watching her with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable but somehow wasn't. There was anger in his expression, but it wasn't directed at her. There was something else too, something that looked almost like understanding. "You're not the first woman to find herself in this situation," he said quietly. "Men like Derek are predators. They're skilled at identifying women with generous hearts and slowly convincing them that they deserve less than they do." The simple validation nearly brought tears to her eyes. For months, Derek had been telling her that she was oversensitive, that his behavior was normal, that she was the problem in their relationship. To hear someone else acknowledge that Derek's treatment was wrong, that she wasn't crazy or ungrateful or impossible to please, felt like being handed oxygen after months of suffocating. "But you stood up to him," she said, still marveling at how quickly the situation had shifted in the restaurant. "He backed down immediately." "How did you know he would?" "Because men like Derek are cowards," Domenico replied, his voice carrying that same quiet authority she'd noticed before. "They pick on people they perceive as weak or isolated. When confronted by someone who isn't afraid of them, they crumble." There was something in the way he said it, the certainty in his voice, that made her curious about his own story. This wasn't theoretical knowledge. He spoke like someone who had experience dealing with dangerous people, who understood the psychology of bullies and predators on a level that went beyond casual observation. "What do you do?" she asked, suddenly realizing she knew almost nothing about the man who had brought her to his penthouse, who was offering her protection from a threat she couldn't handle herself. "I handle problems," he said simply, the answer both vague and somehow completely illuminating. "I make sure that people who hurt others face appropriate consequences." The phrasing was careful, diplomatic, but there were undercurrents she couldn't quite read. Combined with the obvious wealth, the deference of the restaurant's staff, the way Derek had backed down so quickly, it painted a picture of someone who operated in circles far removed from her world of graphic design clients and coffee shop meetings. But instead of feeling afraid, as she probably should have, Celeste found herself feeling safer than she had in months. Whatever Domenico Torino did, however he'd acquired his obvious power and wealth, he was using it to protect her. For the first time since Derek had started showing his true nature, someone was on her side, someone who wasn't afraid of Derek's anger and manipulation. "You're safe here," Domenico said, as if reading her thoughts. Derek can't reach you, can't hurt you. Tomorrow we'll figure out a more permanent solution, but tonight you can rest without worrying about what's waiting for you at home. Home. The word felt foreign now. Her apartment, where Derek had a key and felt free to show up whenever his mood struck him, where every object carried the memory of his criticism and control. That place hadn't felt like home in months. But here, in this stranger's luxurious space, wrapped in his jacket and protected by his quiet strength, she felt something she'd almost forgotten existed. She felt like she might finally be able to breathe. Celeste woke in the most comfortable bed she'd ever experienced, morning sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view of Chicago that made her feel like she was floating above the city. For a blissful moment, she forgot where she was, why she was there, lost in the luxury of Egyptian cotton sheets and the kind of deep sleep that came from feeling truly safe for the first time in months. Then reality crashed back, and with it came the familiar knot of anxiety in her stomach. Derek would be furious about last night. He would blame her for embarrassing him, for involving strangers in their private business, for making him look weak in public. She'd learned to predict his moods, to gauge the severity of his anger by the set of his jaw, the tone of his voice. Last night's humiliation would require retaliation. The smell of coffee drifted from somewhere in the penthouse, rich and inviting, followed by the soft murmur of voices. She found clothes laid out for her, simple but elegant, in exactly her size. The thoughtfulness of the gesture, the way Domenico had anticipated her needs without making her feel like a burden, was so foreign after months of Derek's calculated neglect that it nearly brought tears to her eyes. When she emerged from the guest room, she found Domenico in his kitchen, dressed in dark jeans and a white button-down that somehow managed to look both casual and expensive. He was speaking quietly on his phone in what sounded like Italian, his voice carrying the kind of authority she was beginning to associate with him. When he saw her, his expression softened immediately. "Good morning," he said, ending his call and sliding the phone into his pocket. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I have in weeks," she admitted, accepting the cup of coffee he offered. It was perfect, stronger than she usually drank, but somehow exactly what she needed. Everything in his world seemed to work that way, anticipating desires she hadn't even recognized herself. Before she could ask about his plans for the day, about what happened next in this strange new reality she found herself in, his phone buzzed with a text message. She watched his expression change as he read it, saw the dangerous darkness that flickered across his features before he controlled it. "What is it?" she asked, though part of her already knew. "Derek went to your workplace this morning," Domenico said, his voice carefully controlled. "He demanded to speak with you, and when your boss explained that you weren't coming in today, he became aggressive. Made threats." The coffee turned bitter in her mouth as she imagined the scene. Her boss, Mrs. Chun, was a kind woman in her 60s who ran a small marketing firm with gentle efficiency. The thought of Derek bringing his anger into that peaceful space, threatening someone who had only ever been supportive of Celeste's work, made her feel sick. "I have to call her," Celeste said, reaching for her phone. "I have to apologize, explain somehow." "It's already handled," Domenico said quietly, and something in his tone made her look up sharply. "Derek won't be bothering your workplace again." "What do you mean handled?" Before he could answer, the elevator chimed, and two men entered the penthouse with the easy familiarity of people who belonged there. They were both well-dressed, serious-faced, and they moved with the same controlled grace she'd noticed in Domenico. This wasn't a social visit. "Marco, Tony," Domenico said, nodding toward them. "What do we know?" The man he'd called Marco, younger and leaner, pulled out a tablet and began reading from it with the efficiency of someone delivering a business report. "Derek Mathis, 29, works at Henderson Financial. Has a history of aggressive behavior with women. 2 previous girlfriends filed restraining orders that were later dropped. Currently in debt, gambling problem. Uses his relationship with Miss Rivera to stabilize his finances." Celeste felt her face burn with humiliation as the clinical details of her private life were laid out like evidence in a case file. But worse than the embarrassment was the realization of how thoroughly Derek had deceived her. The restraining orders, the gambling, the way he'd used her financially while making her feel guilty for not contributing enough. She'd been so isolated, so convinced that she was the problem, that she'd never seen the patterns. Tony, the older of the two men, spoke next. This morning's incident at the marketing firm involved threats of violence against the employer and damage to the business if Miss Rivera's location wasn't revealed. The police were called, but Derek left before they arrived. He's escalating. Domenico's jaw tightened as he processed this information, and Celeste found herself studying his profile, noting the way controlled fury made his features sharper, more dangerous. This was not the gentle man who had offered her coffee and comfort. This was someone else entirely, someone who operated in a world where threats were met with swift and decisive action. "I want him gone," Domenico said quietly, but the words carried the weight of absolute authority. Permanently. The casual way he said it, the matter-of-fact tone, made Celeste's breath catch. She was witnessing something she wasn't supposed to see, hearing decisions being made that would have consequences she couldn't fully comprehend. But instead of fear, she felt a strange sense of relief. Someone was finally taking Derek seriously as a threat, finally treating his behavior as unacceptable rather than something she should learn to manage. Marco and Tony exchanged a look before Marco spoke again. "We'll need a few hours to set it up properly. Make it look accidental." Accidental. The word hung in the air between them, and Celeste realized with crystalline clarity that she was falling in love with a man who could order someone's death as easily as he'd ordered her coffee. The knowledge should have terrified her, should have sent her running back to her own world of graphic design clients and predictable problems. Instead, she found herself thinking that Derek had finally encountered someone who wouldn't be manipulated or intimidated, someone who would protect her in ways she'd never been able to protect herself. After Marco and Tony left to handle whatever they handled, Celeste found herself alone with Domenico again, the weight of what she'd witnessed settling between them like a third presence in the room. She should ask questions, should demand explanations, should probably be horrified by the casual discussion of making Derek disappear. "You're not what I expected," she said instead, the words coming out softer than she'd intended. "What did you expect? Someone who rescued women from bad situations might be safer, I suppose. More conventional." Domenico moved closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, could feel the warmth radiating from his body. There was nothing conventional about the way Derek was treating you. Sometimes unconventional problems require unconventional solutions. She should be afraid of him. She knew that. Any rational person would be terrified of someone who could command that kind of loyalty, who could make people disappear with a few quiet words. But when she looked at Domenico, when she saw the careful way he moved around her, the respect in his eyes, the gentleness in his touch, she felt safer than she had in her entire adult life. "Tell me about your family," she said, suddenly desperate to understand the man behind the power, to know the story that had shaped him into someone who could be both tender and terrifying. His expression shifted, became more guarded, and she thought he might refuse to answer. But then he sat beside her on the couch, close enough that their knees almost touched, and began to speak. "My father was murdered when I was 15, he said, his voice carefully controlled. "He was trying to leave the business, trying to build something legitimate for our family. Some people didn't appreciate his efforts at reform." The simple words carried depths of pain and anger that made her heart ache for the boy who had lost his father, who had inherited a legacy of violence, and somehow learned to wield it with precision rather than cruelty. She found herself reaching for his hand, offering the same kind of comfort he had given her. "I'm sorry," she whispered, meaning it completely. "He built an empire, but he also built enemies. When he died, I had a choice. I could let everything fall apart, let his killers think they'd won, or I could take control and make sure that what happened to him never happened to anyone under my protection again." She understood then, the careful control, the loyal associates, the way he'd stepped in to help her without hesitation. This was a man who had learned that the world was dangerous, that protection required power, that sometimes the only way to keep people safe was to be more dangerous than the threats they faced. "My mother died when I was 12, Celeste found herself saying, surprising herself with the revelation. "Cancer. My father couldn't handle being a single parent, so my sister Maya and I went to live with our aunt. Maya was only 8, and she blamed herself, thought it was something she'd done that made our father not want us anymore." The words came easier than they ever had before, Maybe because Domenico's own vulnerability had created space for hers. Maybe because she was beginning to understand that strength could come in many forms. She told him about feeling responsible for her younger sister, about working multiple jobs through high school and college to help with expenses, about the way Derek had slowly convinced her that her family was better off without her drama and complications. "I haven't talked to Maya in over a month," she admitted, the guilt sharp in her chest. "Derek said she was trying to turn me against him, that she was jealous of our relationship. I believed him. I actually believed him over my own sister." "Family is complicated," Domenico said softly, his thumb stroking across her knuckles where their hands remained joined. "But the people who love you don't ask you to choose between them and your happiness. They don't isolate you from support systems." The observation was so simple, so obvious, but it cut through months of Derek's manipulation like a blade. Maya had never asked her to choose. Maya had questioned Derek's treatment of her, had worried about the changes in Celeste's behavior, but she'd never demanded that Celeste abandon her relationship. Derek had been the one insisting on absolute loyalty, demanding that she prove her love by cutting ties with anyone who questioned his behavior. "I think I'm falling in love with you," she whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. "And that should terrify me, because I just watched you order someone's death, and it didn't feel wrong. What does that make me?" "It makes you someone who understands that the world isn't always kind to good people," Domenico said, lifting their joined hands to press a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "It makes you someone who deserves to be protected, cherished, treated like the remarkable woman you are." When he kissed her, it was nothing like Derek's demanding, possessive kisses that always felt like claiming rather than sharing. This was gentle but sure, patient but passionate, the kiss of a man who had all the time in the world to explore the connection growing between them. She melted into him, into the safety and desire and understanding he offered, feeling pieces of herself that had been fractured by months of emotional abuse begin to heal. The moment was interrupted by his phone buzzing insistently. Domenico pulled back reluctantly, his forehead resting against hers for a moment before he reached for the device. His expression changed as he read the message, becoming granite hard in a way that made her stomach clench with dread. "What is it?" she asked, though she was beginning to understand that when Domenico looked like that, the news was never good. "Derek contacted your sister," he said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge she'd never heard before. "He told her you'd been kidnapped, that you were being held against your will by dangerous criminals. He convinced her to meet him, said he needed her help to rescue you." The words hit her like physical blows. Maya, sweet Maya who still blamed herself for their father's abandonment, who had always been too trusting, too willing to believe that people were fundamentally good. Derek would prey on her fears, use her love for Celeste as a weapon, manipulate her into a situation where she could be hurt. "Where is she?" Celeste asked, already reaching for her phone, already knowing it was probably too late. "He won't hurt her," Domenico said, but there was something in his voice that suggested he wasn't entirely certain. "He needs her as leverage to force you to come back to him, but that doesn't mean she's safe." For the first time since the confrontation at Romano's, Celeste felt the full weight of what it meant to be involved with someone like Domenico. Derek wasn't just escalating against her anymore. He was bringing innocent people into the conflict, using the people she loved as weapons against her. And now Maya, who had already suffered too much loss in her young life, was in danger because of choices Celeste had made. But looking at Domenico, seeing the controlled fury in his expression, the way his associates moved with military precision to respond to this new threat, she realized something else. Derek had made a critical miscalculation. He'd attacked someone under Domenico Torino's protection, threatened someone Domenico cared about. And men like Domenico didn't forgive that kind of mistake. The call came at 3 in the afternoon, Derek's voice sharp with false urgency, when Celeste answered her phone. She'd been pacing Domenico's penthouse like a caged animal, waiting for word about Maya's safety, her imagination conjuring increasingly terrible scenarios about what Derek might do to her sister in his desperation. "Celeste, thank God," Derek said, his voice carrying just the right note of relief and concern. "I've been trying to reach you for hours. Are you all right?" The performance was flawless, she had to admit. If she hadn't spent the last 24 hours learning to see Derek's manipulations clearly, if she hadn't understood exactly what kind of man he really was, She might have been fooled by the worried boyfriend act. "Where's Maya?" she demanded, cutting through his pretense with a directness that would have earned her days of silent treatment in the past. "What have you done with her?" The mask slipped immediately, his voice dropping to that familiar cold tone that had dominated so many of their private conversations. "She's safe, for now. But that depends entirely on your cooperation." Domenico moved closer, close enough to hear both sides of the conversation, his presence a steady anchor in the storm of fear and fury building in her chest. His associates had been working all day to locate Maya, tracking Derek's movements through methods she didn't want to examine too closely, but so far they'd found nothing. "What do you want?" Celeste asked, though she already knew the answer. "You're going to come home," Derek said, his voice taking on that patient, condescending tone he used when explaining why her thoughts or feelings were wrong. "You're going to apologize for embarrassing me last night, for involving strangers in our private business. You're going to end this ridiculous phase you're going through and remember who you really are. And if I don't, then your sister learns exactly how dangerous the real world can be," Derek replied, all pretense of affection vanishing completely. "I'm texting you an address. You come alone, Celeste. No police, no wealthy boyfriend, no one. Just you, ready to be reasonable about our future together." The line went dead, and Celeste stared at her phone as the address appeared, a warehouse location in one of Chicago's industrial districts. It was exactly the kind of isolated place where terrible things could happen without witnesses, where Derek could do whatever he wanted without fear of interruption. "Absolutely not," Domenico said before she could speak. "This is obviously a trap. He has no intention of letting either of you go." "I have to try," Celeste said, though every instinct was screaming that Domenico was right. "She's my sister. She's only 22, Domenico. She's in this situation because of me, because Derek is using her to get to me. I can't let her pay for my choices. And I can't let you walk into a situation designed to get you killed," Domenico replied, his voice carrying that absolute authority she was learning to recognize. "Derek is desperate, unstable, and armed. This isn't a negotiation he's planning. This is a murder-suicide he's packaging as reconciliation." The clinical assessment sent ice through her veins, but she knew he was right. Derek had moved beyond manipulation into pure vengeance, and men in that state were capable of anything. But knowing that didn't change the fundamental equation. Maya was innocent, and she was in danger because Celeste had finally stood up to her abuser. "Then what do you suggest?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "We end this," Domenico said simply. "But we do it properly, with planning and backup and no unnecessary risks to people I care about." The next 2 hours passed in a blur of preparation that gave her a glimpse into the military precision with which Domenico operated. Maps of the warehouse district, surveillance photos, equipment she didn't recognize, but that looked serious and expensive. Marco and Tony returned with additional men, all of them moving with the coordinated efficiency of a team that had worked together many times before. Watching them plan, seeing the careful consideration of every variable, every possible outcome, Celeste understood that this wasn't the first time Domenico had handled a situation like this. These men knew how to eliminate threats, how to protect innocent people, how to ensure that people like Derek faced consequences for their actions. "You're staying here," Domenico told her as they prepared to leave. "This isn't negotiable. Derek expects you to come alone, which means he'll be watching for exactly that. When he realizes you're not coming, he'll either panic or get angry. Either way, we'll be ready." But she couldn't just sit in his penthouse while other people risked their lives to save her sister. She couldn't be passive while the most important relationship in her life hung in the balance. Maya was her responsibility, her family, her failure to protect. "I'm coming with you," she said, and something in her voice must have surprised him because his expression shifted, became more assessing. "Celeste, this isn't a movie. This is real violence by real criminals against real people. You could get hurt. Or worse, you could get Maya hurt by being there when things go wrong. Maya is there because Derek knows I love her," Celeste said, meeting his gaze directly. "She's there because he knows I'll do anything to protect her. If there's even a chance that my presence could keep her safer, then I have to take that chance." They argued for 10 minutes, Domenico's protective instincts warring with his recognition that she had a point. Derek's entire plan depended on his belief that he understood Celeste, that he could predict her responses and use them against her. But the woman who would have come to that warehouse alone out of guilt and fear no longer existed. She'd been replaced by someone who understood that protection sometimes required dangerous choices. In the end, they compromised. She would come, but she would stay with the car, protected by one of Domenico's men, ready to run if things went wrong. She would be close enough to intervene if Derek's desperation made him unpredictable, but far enough away that she wouldn't complicate the tactical situation. The warehouse was exactly as grim as she'd imagined, a sprawling complex of rusted metal and broken windows that spoke of economic decline and urban decay. Perfect for Derek's purposes, isolated enough that screams wouldn't carry, complex enough that escape routes were limited. Domenico's team moved like shadows in the gathering darkness, positioning themselves with the patience of predators who knew their prey was already trapped. Through the scope that Marco handed her, she could see Derek pacing inside the main building, Maya tied to a chair beside him, her face pale with fear, but her chin lifted with the stubborn courage that ran in their family. The sight of her sister, vulnerable and afraid because of Derek's obsession with control, filled Celeste with a cold fury she'd never experienced before. This man had tormented her for months, had made her doubt her own worth and reality, had isolated her from everyone who cared about her. But involving Maya, threatening an innocent woman to satisfy his twisted need for dominance, was unforgivable. When Domenico's team moved, it was with devastating efficiency. Derek had positioned himself well for intimidation, but poorly for defense. Within minutes, his warehouse fortress had become a trap with him at the center, Domenico's men controlling every exit, every angle, every possibility of escape. She watched through the scope as Domenico himself entered the building, moving with the confidence of someone who held all the advantages. Even from a distance, she could see Derek's shock as he realized that his carefully planned revenge had become his own execution. The confrontation was brief and decisive. Derek, faced with actual consequences for his actions for the first time in his life, revealed exactly what kind of man he really was. He grabbed Maya, using her as a human shield, his desperation making him dangerous in the way that cornered animals were dangerous. But Domenico had faced desperate men before, had dealt with people who thought human shields guaranteed their safety. The shot was precise, professional, final. Derek collapsed without ceremony, without dramatic last words, without the significance he'd always believed he deserved. When it was over, when Maya was free and Derek's threat was permanently eliminated, Celeste found herself running toward the warehouse despite her promise to stay back. She needed to hold her sister, to confirm that Maya was really safe, to apologize for bringing this horror into their lives. Maya was shaken but unharmed, clinging to Celeste with the desperate relief of someone who had genuinely believed she might die. Through her tears, she whispered apologies for doubting Celeste's judgment, for not seeing Derek's true nature sooner, for not being stronger when it mattered. But Celeste's attention was divided. Part of her focused on comforting Maya, part of her watching Domenico as he supervised the cleanup of Derek's body, the removal of evidence, the transformation of a crime scene back into an empty warehouse. This was his world, she realized. Violence and protection, consequences and justice administered outside the legal system. And she was choosing it. Choosing him. Choosing a life where love came with bodyguards and enemies, where protection required power that most people would find terrifying. By the time they returned to the penthouse, Maya was safely on her way home with two of Domenico's men assigned as discreet protection, and Celeste was finally alone with the man who had just killed for her. The man she was falling in love with despite everything that should have made that impossible. "You're hurt," she said, noticing the cut on his hand for the first time, the way he favored his left shoulder. "It's nothing," Domenico replied, but she was already reaching for him, already guiding him toward the bathroom, where she could examine the injuries properly. Taking care of him felt natural, necessary, like something she'd been meant to do her entire life. The cut on his hand was shallow but dirty, the shoulder strained from moving too quickly while wearing body armor. As she cleaned the wound and bandaged it carefully, she was intensely aware of his closeness, of the trust implied in letting her tend to him, of the intimacy in these quiet moments after violence. "You could have been killed tonight," she said, her voice catching as the reality of what had almost happened hit her fully. "But I wasn't," he replied, his hand coming up to cup her cheek, thumb stroking gently across her skin. "And Derek will never hurt you or anyone you love again." The simple promise, delivered with absolute certainty, broke something open inside her. This man had risked his life for her sister, had eliminated a threat most people would have been powerless against, had offered her the kind of protection she'd never known existed. And he'd done it all without asking for anything in return except her safety. "I love you," she whispered, the words carrying months of suppressed emotion. The relief of finally being able to love someone without fear, without conditions, without the constant anxiety that her feelings would be used against her. When he kissed her this time, it was different from the gentle exploration they'd shared before. This was deeper, more certain, the kiss of two people who had seen the worst of each other's worlds and chosen to build something beautiful anyway. Making love with Domenico was nothing like the mechanical, demanding encounters Derek had called intimacy. This was reverent, patient, focused entirely on her pleasure and comfort, as if he had all the time in the world to learn what made her gasp, what made her arch against him, what made her whisper his name like a prayer. Afterward, lying in his arms in the massive bed with Chicago's lights twinkling beyond the windows, Celeste felt something she'd thought Derek had destroyed forever. She felt whole. 3 weeks after Derek's death, Celeste sat in a conference room at the Chicago Police Department, watching Detective Sarah Morrison review the final paperwork that would officially close the case. The story was simple, clean, believable. Derek Mathis had been found dead in an abandoned warehouse, apparently the victim of a robbery gone wrong while conducting some kind of illegal business transaction. The detective was thorough but not suspicious, asking routine questions about Derek's recent behavior, his financial situation, any enemies he might have made. Celeste answered truthfully where she could, carefully where she couldn't, always aware that Domenico's influence had ensured this investigation would find exactly what it was supposed to find and nothing more. "We're ruling it a homicide committed during the commission of a felony," Detective Morrison explained, closing the file with a satisfied air. "Mr. Mathis appears to have gotten involved with some dangerous people, probably related to his gambling debts. Sometimes these situations resolve themselves." Celeste nodded appropriately, expressed the right amount of shock and sadness, played the role of the grieving ex-girlfriend who was cooperating fully with the investigation. But inside, she felt nothing but relief that Derek's chapter in her life was finally, permanently closed. When she emerged from the police station, Domenico was waiting for her, leaning against his car in the afternoon sunlight like something from a magazine. 3 weeks of living in his world had made her more comfortable with the luxury, the protection, the way people treated her differently when they understood she belonged to Domenico Torino. But she still felt a flutter of amazement that this powerful, dangerous, devastatingly attractive man was hers. "How did it go?" he asked, pulling her into his arms with the casual possessiveness that made her feel cherished rather than owned. "Closed case," she said, allowing herself to sink into his strength, his warmth, the safety that had become as natural as breathing. Detective Morrison seemed satisfied with the official version of events. "Good," Domenico said, his lips brushing the top of her head. "Now we can focus on building our life together without looking over our shoulders." Their life together. The phrase still sent warmth through her chest, the promise of a future that belonged to both of them, free from Derek's shadow and built on the foundation of genuine love and respect she'd never thought she deserved. The drive back to the penthouse took them through the heart of Chicago, past the restaurant where they'd first met, past the marketing firm where she'd built her modest client base, past the landmarks of her old life that seemed simultaneously familiar and foreign now. So much had changed in such a short time that sometimes she felt like she was looking at someone else's memories. At the penthouse, she found flowers waiting for her, an enormous arrangement of white lilies and pale roses that filled the entry with their delicate fragrance. The card was simple, elegant, for new beginnings. Love D. He'd been doing things like this for weeks now, small gestures of thoughtfulness that showed he was paying attention to her preferences, her moods, her needs. After months of Derek's calculated neglect, the constant consideration felt almost overwhelming in its generosity. "They're beautiful," she said, standing on her toes to kiss him, still amazed by his willingness to be tender, to show affection without demanding something in return. "I wanted today to feel like a celebration," he said, his hands settling on her waist with gentle possessiveness. "The end of the past, the beginning of our future." Our future had become her favorite phrase. The way it acknowledged that they were building something together, that her dreams and goals were as important as his, that this wasn't about her fitting into his existing life, but about creating something new that belonged to both of them. Speaking of the future, Domenico continued, his expression shifting into something more serious. "There's someone I'd like you to meet." An hour later, Celeste found herself sitting in the elegant living room of Isabella Torino, Domenico's mother, trying not to be intimidated by the tiny woman whose sharp eyes seemed to see everything. At 72, Isabella was still beautiful, her silver hair styled perfectly, her posture erect with the kind of dignity that came from a lifetime of commanding respect. "So you're the woman who's captured my son's heart," Isabella said, her accent more pronounced than Domenico's, carrying the musicality of someone who had learned English as a second language. "He speaks of nothing but you, you know." The words were warm, but there was assessment in Isabella's gaze, the careful evaluation of a mother protecting her child. Celeste understood the scrutiny, respected it even. Isabella had lost her husband to violence, had raised her son in a world where trust was dangerous and love could be weaponized. Of course, she would be cautious about anyone claiming to care for Domenico. They talked for 2 hours, Isabella sharing stories of Domenico's childhood, his academic achievements, the way he'd transformed his father's legacy from purely criminal enterprise into something more complex, more ethical within the constraints of his world. Celeste found herself relaxing, laughing at tales of a young Domenico who collected stray cats and insisted on reading bedtime stories to them. By the time they left, Isabella had extracted a promise that Celeste would come for Sunday dinner the following week, and had made several pointed observations about how much happier Domenico seemed since meeting her. The approval wasn't entirely won yet, but it was coming, and Celeste found she cared about earning it more than she'd expected. The next major integration came when Domenico surprised her by meeting with Mrs. Chun, her former boss, about expanding her design business. Instead of expecting her to abandon her career for his world, he wanted to invest in her dreams, to give her the resources to build something substantial and independent. "I know how important your work is to you," he said as they sat in Mrs. Chen's office, discussing the possibilities for Celeste's future. "I want you to have everything you've dreamed of, but with the security to pursue it without financial stress." The conversation that followed was surreal, watching Mrs. Chen's eyes widen as Domenico outlined his vision for supporting Celeste's business expansion, providing startup capital, office space, connections to potential clients who would appreciate her creativity and attention to detail. He wasn't trying to control her career or reshape it to suit his purposes. He was simply removing obstacles, creating opportunities, investing in her success because it mattered to her. Walking out of that meeting, Celeste felt something shift inside her, a confidence she'd thought Derek had destroyed forever beginning to rebuild itself. She had dreams again, plans that extended beyond simple survival, goals that felt achievable with the right support and encouragement. The reconciliation with Maya came more gradually, built through weekly dinners and careful conversations that slowly rebuilt the trust Derek had systematically undermined. Maya was initially suspicious of Domenico, worried that Celeste had simply traded one controlling man for another, more dangerous one. But watching them together, seeing the way Domenico deferred to Celeste's opinions, supported her decisions, encouraged her independence, Maya began to understand the difference between protection and control, between love and possession. "I was wrong about him," Maya admitted one evening as they walked along the lakefront, the Chicago skyline glittering across the water. "And I was wrong about Derek, too. I should have seen what he was doing to you. Should have fought harder to make you see it." "You were 21, Celeste said gently. "It wasn't your job to save me from my own poor choices. But I'm sorry I let him convince me to pull away from you. I'm sorry I chose his version of reality over our relationship. The healing wasn't complete, couldn't be after the months of damage Derek had inflicted, but it was real and growing stronger." Maya even began dating one of Domenico's younger associates, a sweet man named Luca, who who treated her with the kind of respect that seemed to run in Domenico's circle of friends. The proposal came on a quiet Tuesday evening, 3 months after Derek's death, as they cooked dinner together in Domenico's kitchen. It was domestic, ordinary, perfect in its simplicity. Celeste was chopping vegetables while Domenico handled the pasta, both of them moving around each other with the easy familiarity of a couple who had learned each other's rhythms. "Marry me," he said suddenly, the words cutting through their comfortable conversation about weekend plans and Maya's new job. Celeste looked up, knife suspended over the cutting board, wondering if she'd heard correctly. "What?" "I love you," Domenico said, setting down his wooden spoon and turning to face her fully. "I love your courage, your creativity, your determination to build something beautiful even after someone tried to convince you that you deserve nothing. I love the way you tend to my cuts like they matter, the way you've made friends with my mother, the way you've turned this place into a home instead of just an expensive apartment." He moved closer, his hands settling on her shoulders with the gentle reverence she'd come to associate with his touch. "I love that you chose me even after seeing exactly what I'm capable of, even after understanding the kind of life I can offer you. I want to spend the rest of my life earning that trust, protecting that courage, supporting those dreams. Marry me, Celeste. Build a life with me." The ring he produced was beautiful but not ostentatious, a vintage setting that spoke of elegance rather than display, chosen specifically for her tastes rather than to impress others. It was perfect, like everything else about this moment, about this man who had somehow learned to love her exactly as she was while helping her become more than she'd ever thought possible. "Yes," she whispered, laughing through sudden tears as he slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that shook slightly despite their usual steadiness. "Yes, absolutely yes." Planning their wedding became an exercise in blending their worlds, honoring both the family traditions that mattered to Isabella and the simple elegance Celeste preferred. They chose a small ceremony, intimate and meaningful, with only the people who truly mattered to them present. As the date approached, Celeste found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her here, from the terrified woman in Romano's restaurant to someone confident enough to marry into one of Chicago's most powerful families. The transformation hadn't been magic, hadn't happened overnight. It had been built through daily choices, through learning to trust her own judgment again, through discovering what love looked like when it came from someone who wanted to build her up rather than tear her down. Do you recognize the signs of a healthy relationship versus a toxic one? The question echoed in her mind as she watched couples in restaurants, in coffee shops, in the everyday spaces where she'd once been so miserable. She could see it now. The difference between partners who supported each other and those who competed, between love that liberated and possession that imprisoned. The woman who had accepted Derek's treatment as normal was gone, replaced by someone who understood her own worth, who could identify red flags before they became prison walls. That knowledge felt like armor, like a gift she could give to other women who might be walking on their own eggshells, waiting for someone to show them what real love looked like. Sitting in Domenico's arms on the balcony of their penthouse, the ring on her finger catching the light from Chicago's skyline, Celeste felt the deep satisfaction of a life reclaimed, a future chosen rather than endured. She was exactly where she belonged. 6 months after Derek's death, Celeste stood in front of the full-length mirror in Isabella's bedroom, watching her future mother-in-law fuss over the final details of her wedding dress with the focused intensity of a woman who had been waiting decades to help plan her son's wedding. The dress was perfect, simple ivory silk that flowed like water, elegant without being ostentatious, chosen to reflect Celeste's own style rather than conforming to someone else's vision of what a bride should look like. "You're radiant," Isabella murmured, adjusting the delicate veil one final time. "Domenico is going to forget how to breathe when he sees you." The words carried warmth and genuine affection that still amazed Celeste sometimes. Isabella's acceptance hadn't come easily, earned through months of Sunday dinners and careful conversations, through proving that her feelings for Domenico were real and lasting rather than opportunistic. But once won, Isabella's approval had been fierce and protective, welcoming Celeste into the family with the kind of unconditional love she'd thought only existed in fairy tales. Maya appeared in the doorway, stunning in her bridesmaid dress of pale blue silk, her face glowing with happiness and pride. The relationship between the sisters had not only healed but deepened, built on a foundation of honesty about Derek's abuse and mutual support as they both moved forward into healthier futures. Maya's own relationship with Luca had blossomed into something sweet and stable, a love story that proved good men existed in Domenico's world alongside the dangerous ones. The photographers want to take some pictures before the ceremony, Maya said, but her eyes were soft as she looked at Celeste. You look absolutely beautiful, like you're glowing from the inside out. The glow was happiness, pure and simple, the kind of deep contentment that came from knowing she was exactly where she belonged, marrying exactly the right person for exactly the right reasons. No fear, no doubt, no nagging voice in the back of her mind suggesting she was making a mistake or settling for less than she deserved. Just joy, anticipation, and the bone-deep certainty that her life was finally beginning. Her business had flourished beyond her wildest dreams, supported by Domenico's investment but driven by her own creativity and determination. The Rivera Design Studio now occupied a beautiful space in downtown Chicago, employing 3 other designers and serving clients ranging from small family businesses to major corporations seeking fresh perspectives. She'd built something real, something lasting, something entirely her own while being loved and supported by a man who celebrated her success rather than feeling threatened by it. The ceremony took place in the garden of a historic estate outside the city, surrounded by late spring flowers and the people who mattered most to them. Domenico's associates mingled seamlessly with her college friends. Maya chatted easily with Isabella, and even Mrs. Chun was there, beaming with pride as she watched her former employee marry into one of Chicago's most prominent families. Walking down the aisle on the arm of Uncle Frank, who had stepped in to fill the father role with touching dignity, Celeste felt overwhelmed by the perfection of the moment. The setting was beautiful, elegant, but warm. Exactly what she'd dreamed of during all those years when she'd thought marriage was something that happened to other people, luckier people, people who knew how to choose better than she did. But most of all, there was Domenico waiting for her at the altar, devastatingly handsome in his black tuxedo, his dark eyes bright with emotion as he watched her approach. This was the man who had rescued her from Derek's abuse, who had shown her what protection looked like when it came from love rather than control, who had killed for her, and then tenderly bandaged his own wounds while she wept with relief and gratitude. The vows they exchanged were personal, written separately, but echoing themes of healing, growth, protection, and partnership. Domenico promised to cherish her independence while offering his strength, to support her dreams while sharing his world, to love her with honesty and respect for as long as they both lived. Celeste promised to trust his protection while maintaining her own identity, to build their life together while keeping her individual goals, to love him completely despite and because of his complexity. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, when Domenico kissed her with gentle passion while their guests cheered, Celeste felt something settle into place in her soul, a sense of coming home that had nothing to do with geography and everything to do with finding the person who made her feel complete. The reception flowed seamlessly from cocktails on the terrace to dinner in the estate's ballroom, music and laughter and conversation creating the kind of warm celebration that made everyone feel included and valued. She danced with Domenico to their chosen song, Lost in Your Eyes, moving together with the natural grace of 2 people who had learned each other's rhythms in countless quiet moments at home. Watching him interact with their guests, seeing the respect he commanded and the affection he inspired, Celeste marveled again at the complexity of the man she'd married. These people knew exactly what Domenico was capable of, understood the power he wielded and the violence he could command, but they also saw his loyalty, his protection of those he loved, his careful honor within a world that often lacked such constraints. During a quiet moment between courses, as their guests enjoyed the evening and each other's company, Domenico leaned close to whisper in her ear. "No regrets?" he asked, his voice carrying just a hint of vulnerability that reminded her this powerful man still needed reassurance that she'd chosen him freely, completely, permanently. "Only that it took me so long to find you," she replied, turning to kiss him softly, tasting wine and happiness and the promise of their future together. The evening wound down gradually, guests departing with warm wishes and promises to visit soon. The wedding party helping to clear the last details while Celeste and Domenico stole moments alone on the terrace, watching the stars appear over the Illinois countryside. In a few hours they would leave for their honeymoon in Tuscany, 2 weeks of exploring Domenico's ancestral homeland, while beginning their marriage in the most romantic setting they could imagine. But first, there was one more tradition to honor. At Isabella's insistence, they returned to Romano's for a late dinner, the same restaurant where they'd first met, where Derek had threatened her and Domenico had intervened to change the course of both their lives. The staff recognized them immediately, seating them at a table near the windows where they could watch the city lights twinkle beyond the glass. "It feels like a lifetime ago," Celeste said, looking around the elegant dining room that held such pivotal memories. "Like it happened to someone else entirely." "In many ways it did," Domenico replied, his fingers intertwined with hers across the white tablecloth. "The woman Derek was terrorizing doesn't exist anymore. She grew into someone stronger, someone who knows her own worth, someone brave enough to love without fear." The observation was true, but incomplete. Yes, she had grown and healed and learned to trust her own judgment again. But that transformation hadn't happened in isolation. It had been nurtured by Domenico's patient love, supported by his unwavering belief in her potential, protected by his willingness to eliminate threats she couldn't handle herself. "I couldn't have done it without you," she said, meaning it completely. "Not just the healing, not just building my confidence back up. I couldn't have survived Derek's escalation if you hadn't been there. He would have destroyed me completely. And I couldn't have learned to love without you," Domenico replied, his thumb stroking across her wedding ring. "I thought protecting people meant keeping them at a distance, that caring too much made everyone vulnerable. You taught me the difference between isolation and safety, between strength and connection." Over dinner, they talked about their plans for the business, for the house they were buying in Lake Forest, for the family they both hoped to build together someday. The conversation was easy, natural, full of shared dreams and mutual respect, the kind of partnership Celeste had never thought existed outside of romantic movies. When they finally returned to the penthouse that would remain their Chicago home base, Celeste felt the deep satisfaction of a perfect day, a celebration that honored both their pasts and their future, surrounded by people who genuinely cared about their happiness. As they prepared for bed, moving around each other with the comfortable intimacy of newlyweds, Celeste caught sight of herself in the bathroom mirror and paused, startled by what she saw. The woman looking back at her was confident, glowing, obviously loved and secure in that love. Her eyes held no trace of the fear that had dominated her expression during the Derek years, no shadow of doubt or anxiety or the constant hypervigilance that came from living with an abuser. This was what she looked like when she was truly happy, truly safe, truly valued for exactly who she was. Later, lying in Domenico's arms as he slept peacefully beside her, Celeste allowed herself to think about the future they were building together, the possibilities that stretched ahead of them like an open road. There would be challenges, she knew. His world would always carry certain dangers, certain complications that came from operating outside conventional society. There would be difficult decisions, moral complexities, situations that tested her ability to love someone whose methods were sometimes as ruthless as his motives were protective. But there would also be love, real love that supported rather than diminished, that protected without controlling, that celebrated her victories rather than feeling threatened by them. There would be partnership, mutual respect, the kind of relationship she'd given up hoping existed. And maybe, if they were very lucky, there would be children who would grow up knowing the difference between love and possession, between protection and control, between the kind of man their father was and the kind of man Derek had been. The thought made her smile as she drifted toward sleep, one hand resting protectively over her still flat abdomen where new life might already be beginning, the other secure in Domenico's warm grasp. 6 months ago, she had been trapped in a relationship that was slowly destroying her soul, convinced that Derek's treatment was what she deserved, what love looked like, what her future held. She had accepted cruelty disguised as concern, control masquerading as protection, possession presented as devotion. Now she understood the difference. Real love didn't demand that she become smaller, quieter, more grateful for whatever scraps of affection she received. Real love celebrated her ambitions, supported her independence, encouraged her growth into the fullest version of herself. Real love protected without imprisoning, guided without controlling, supported without diminishing. Real love looked like Domenico Torino promising to cherish her strength while offering his own, committed to building a life together that honored both their dreams while keeping both their hearts safe. As sleep finally claimed her, Celeste Rivera Torino smiled in the darkness, secure in the knowledge that she had found what she'd been searching for her entire life. She had found home.